As I know it's past 10 o'clock. We're solving our technical problems. I appreciate you all coming out here on this cold winter's morning. It seems like winter to me at least, especially the European politics students and other folks as well. This is something that Rebecca suggested to me a while ago about, I'm Tim Helling, by the way, the director of the Institute for European Studies, and we were thinking this summer about what kind of program to do this year, and the idea of Euroskepticism came up as something that would, what is going on in Europe today? Well, there is sort of new ideas about backlashes against the European Union project, right? Popular support for the EU might be in jeopardy based on some recent election results, especially for the European Parliament. So we have two experts here in European politics and the European Union to talk about and hopefully have a good discussion, start a discussion about Euroscepticism, what it means for democracy in some of the world's oldest democracies, right? And so I'd like to introduce them very quickly. We have Seth Jolly here. Seth is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the Maxwell School of Public Affairs at Syracuse University. He teaches European politics, quantitative methods, political parties, and ethnic conflict in the European Union. Your book is out or is just coming out?
Next year.
Next year, his book is coming out on the European Union and the rise of regional parties. And this book explores how European integration affects regionalist parties, different kinds of political parties in the EU. And he's also done a lot of work on political parties with the whole expert survey, and I think he's going to show some of this data here today. We also are happy to have John McCormick here, down from Indianapolis. John is the Jean Monnet Professor of European Union Politics at IUPUI. His research focuses on the EU, comparative politics, transatlantic relations, and British politics. He's written 12 books and several book chapters and journal articles. Many of you might be familiar with some of his textbooks if you've taken the European Union class. He's won 3 School of Liberal Arts Teaching Awards and has raised nearly $1.25 million in research and teaching grants. And his most recent book is Why Europe Matters, The Case for the European Union, published by Palgrave in 2013. So please join me both in welcome. And we thought that Seth would go ahead and present first, and then turn it over to John.
Sure, as long as it's okay with you all, I'll just stay seated and keep it like a round table, and I wanted to thank you all for bringing me in. It's unfortunately the only time of the year I think where Bloomington's colder than Syracuse, and so I appreciate that welcome as well. I'm actually from Louisville, right down the road, so it's a little bit of a nice homecoming too. As Tim said, the Eurosceptic parties saw quite a bit of a surge in the May elections for the European Parliament. So the European Parliament is this nearly continent-wide national election, and everyone votes at the same time. It's the only time this happens anywhere in the world where a supranational organization has a democratically elected body all at the same time. And there was quite a bit of concern at the time about what the results meant for the future of democracy and the future of the EU, and that's, I think, what sparked the talk. I wanted to start actually with some basic facts about the EU before we kind of get into that, and I think what you'll see is that my talk raises more questions than it has answers, but I'm more optimistic, I think, than some others might be about these parties, these far-right parties, and what they mean for democracy. So the first step is, like, what does the public think about the EU? So this is kind of a classic measure, is the most basic. Do you think that being in the EU is a good thing or a bad thing? It's the most bottom line thing. It doesn't require almost any knowledge about very specific aspects of the EU. You can see over time, you get some variation along the way, with a big spike in the late 80s and early 90s. That was kind of the heyday of the EU. You're leading up to the Treaty of European Union, and it was kind of all very optimistic. At that point, remember, we're only talking about 12 members, not the 28 that we have now. It drops dramatically in the late 90s with the advent of the euro. There's a lot of skepticism about the new currency and everything. Since then, though, you kind of see there's nothing really going on. It's kind of up and down, not really bad. So I'll highlight that one period. So this is just 2001 to 2011. It goes up a little bit and then starts to fall with the Euro crisis. So the Euro crisis in the late 2000s, the public's skeptical about everything, basically, because they see politicians as having failed them to a certain degree. So you see that, but I don't think what we can say is that there's a clear trend towards everyone hating the EU. In fact, as I'll show later, there's a little bit of a rebound now that we're coming out of the Euro crisis in terms of public support. So that's kind of setting the stage of course, there's a big drop after the Euro crisis, and that's kind of where we are, just barely coming out. People pretty skeptical. So I'm going to talk about a few examples of the parties, but first talk about these recent elections that has people worried. You saw titles, if you read, like the Financial Times or the Economist or whatever, Euroskeptics storm Brussels, the French mainstream parties talked about earthquake election, so what were they so concerned about? The first one is that for the first time, two far-right, what we think of as radical populist parties, became the biggest nationwide parties in a national election. So it's the European election, not national elections, but the French National Front is the party that most people know outside the US. They were led for a long time by Jean-Marie Le Pen, now by his daughter Marine Le Pen, but have their position is definitely Eurosceptic, which means they don't like the EU. They're anti-immigrant and various other things. And the Danish People's Party also became the biggest party during the 2014 EP election. Again, a pretty far-right party in terms of ideological scores. Now, biggest nationwide party for Americans, like you all might know a lot about European politics, but most Americans think biggest party, that's like 40 or 50%, right? Biggest party is 22%, right? This is one party among many that are there, and this is not the domestic parliament. So keep that in mind. The other part that concerned people, and Cas Muda's written a lot about this on the Monkey Cage and other blogs, is for the first time in recent memory, two pretty much out-and-out neo-fascist parties won seats. In Greece, the Golden Dawn Party, which you may have heard about, an extreme anti-immigrant party. In fact, half the leadership team is either on trial or in jail at the moment, but known to have like militia groups on the ground taking care of immigrants, let's say it that way. I think there's a lot of things going on with the Golden Dawn that are disturbing to people of all ideological persuasions. And the National Democratic Party of Germany, Golden Dawn was actually pretty competitive. They won 7 or 8%. The National Democratic Party only won a seat, I think, and that was only because Germany basically let anybody who won any seats in the European Parliament election get a seat. So they have the Joke Party, the National Democratic Party, a bunch of really interesting parties there. So this was a big concern to people. And so you can kind of look across at a lot of these parties, these far-right parties, who many of whom share one or two things. They're Eurosceptic, meaning they want the EU to either end or be changed dramatically. And most of them are heavily anti-immigrant, which is a concern that I'm interested in. So you can see across these, the blue is EP elections in 2009, the green is EP in 2014. You see big upswings for several of these parties. UKIP, the UK Independence Party, the Danish People's Party, and the National Front are the biggest winners. Austria's Freedom Party also did quite well. After that, it starts to look a little different, right? It's not, these few parties did really well, but overall, a lot of these parties either did the same or a little bit worse. There's two other parties that I mentioned, Golden Dawn, and then a party I'll talk about later is the Alternative for Democracy Party in Germany, which is different than these other parties in a couple of ways that I'll talk about. And I think the way we want to think about this, or the way that I want to think about this, is that it's not a full earthquake. Only 10 out of 28 of the European Union member countries elected a Eurosceptic party, right, into any of their seats. So it's a third that's concerning, but it's not quite as big as it could have been. And in fact, there's an increase of only 15 total far-right MEPs, members of European Parliament. And that is mostly due to these three parties here. Okay. So this is the change, right? These are the new parties. That's what people want to talk about. I would say that one of the things that we could talk about is actually continuity in the EP. So Peter Mayer and Gallagher and Michael Laver wrote a textbook about parties in European politics that I like a lot. And one of the things that they talk about is everybody talks about the growth in the new parties. Nobody talks about the consistency in the old parties. And you probably don't know, these are the party groups in the European Parliament. Each one is kind of a little bit different. So for instance, the EPP, the biggest party, are the Conservatives and Christian Democrats. It's like the center-right party. It's been the biggest party group for quite some time. They lost some votes. They went from like mid-30s to right below 30%. The Socialists and Social Democrats, this is like German Social Democrats, British Labour, and so on. They're the second biggest party, quite a bit. The parties that are of concern to us when we're talking today are the Euroskeptic groupings. And these are these groups here, right? All of whom saw a little bit of an upswing, right? But still all below 10%. And as I said before, they share a couple of things. They don't like the EU, they don't like immigrants, but they also often don't like each other. So, as you can imagine, if part of your party goal is about how French nationalism is so important, it doesn't make sense for you to ally with someone who says that their nationality is the best. But anyways, the ECR is the more mainstream one. That's the one led by the British Tories, and includes the Alternative for Democracy. They have about 9%. UKIP and the Sweden Democrats are in the EFDD, this second to last group. And the one that's actually of concern to most people is this group here, which is, it's actually non-attached, and I is non-inscrete. It's people that can't actually agree on a party together. So it's the National Front, Vlaams Belang in Belgium, the Freedom Party in Austria, Golden Dawn, Jobbik, and Northern League. So they agree that they don't like the euro, but they don't agree on much of anything else, and so they can't do what parties usually do. And I think what that means is that that dampens the effect that they can have because they can't coordinate against the mainstream parties. So I'll talk about a couple of examples. I know I think John is going to talk a lot about UKIP, so I'll try to talk about a couple of others. The Alternative for Democracy is the new one. If you read The Economist, they've been in several times in recent months. They are what I think political scientists would call a soft Eurosceptic position. So a hard Eurosceptic position is we want out of the EU. So let's quit the EU, go do our own thing, like Switzerland and other countries. That's not what the Alternative for Democracy wants. What are they concerned? They want to stop things like the Eurozone bailouts. They think Germany's paid too big of a cost to keep Greece and Portugal and Ireland and so on afloat. And so they're all about reforming, not rejecting the EU. And you'll see a thread of this where this party, for instance, wants nothing to do with the Golden Dawn, National Fronts, and those types of parties, right? They're very hesitant to be grouped with those. They do continue on this emphasis on immigration restrictions, which is a continued theme, which I'll come back to later. Two things about the potential effect of AfD in German politics. One is they have, both because of their rise and because of FDP, the Liberal Party, FDP is the Liberal Party, FDP is pretty much gone as a national force for the last 30, 40, 50 years. They've been the kingmaker. They've gone between forming coalitions with either the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats, but in recent state elections, they've lost nearly all of their support, and the expectation is that they won't get enough votes in the next national election to maintain, which is a big deal because, again, they've shown themselves willing to ally with the main parties to govern, whereas some of the far right parties are not able to do that. The other concern for the center-right party, the Christian Democrats, is that it will splinter their vote. So AfD will pull off some of their people who are more anti-immigrant and skeptical of the EU. And this will show up on the next slide, but the Alternative for Democracy is really the only legitimate Eurosceptic party. So if you're a voter in Germany and you're concerned about the euro, you don't like it, you don't have all that many options. The Social Democrats are for it, the Christian Democrats are for it, the other mainstream parties are for it. The only party that's anti-EU in Germany with any kind of electoral position is the left party, Die Linke. And they're barely on the Euroskeptic side, so they're not like hard Euroskeptics or anything either. And Germany's unique in this, even though they're kind of the breadbasket of the EU in a lot of ways. Only Spain and Estonia have as few Eurosceptic party options. And I think the next slide I'll show a little bit about this. This, again, Tim mentioned this. This is data that we collect all across Europe, the EU, and other countries by experts to place parties. So each one of these dots is a political party. What you see is, so the 1 through 7 is support for the EU, 7 is highest, 1 is they hate the EU and they want out. There's only a couple parties down there, and there's only a couple parties at the very top. This fitted line shows the upside down U shape, which means that the extreme parties on either side don't like the EU. So the far left parties, the communists and some of the other radical left parties, don't like the EU because it's not democratic enough, because it's too neoliberal, for a variety of reasons like that. But there aren't that many parties over there. These parties don't like it because of nationalist reasons and immigration reasons and other stuff. They don't like the centralist mindset of the EU. Most parties, like all the mainstream parties, which mean by mainstream I mean kind of in the middle of the ideological scale, center right, center left, moderate parties, they all pretty much are for it. Of course you get some exceptions, but what this shows is that voters, if voters are down here on the EU scale, their options are a little bit limited. They don't really have a lot of democratic choice. If they're moderate on left-right, let's say they think welfare state's pretty good, but they don't want taxes to raise too high, they're kind of right in the middle, and they don't like the EU, they don't really have many choices, right? And if you don't like the EU, so voters have to decide which issue is most important to them, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Are you keeping track of time?
Yeah. So, okay. 8 minutes, maybe.
Okay. So just briefly, I would say it seems like it's just a far-right thing because the parties that get the most press are far-right. Danish People's Party, National Front, Jobbik, and so on. But it's actually not just right-wing, and I kind of showed that the radical left parties are over there too. The two parties I would bring up are the Five Star Movement in Italy, maybe something you all have heard of. It's a comedian. Beppe Grillo starts this party. He doesn't even call it a party. It's not really left or right. It's off the normal ideological scale. He just thinks everybody's doing everything wrong, right? And he kind of wants to shake everything up, break everything. So populist, he definitely is a Eurosceptic. And won 25% of parliamentary seats in the last election, which I think says a lot about the Italians. I was talking to Tim before. When we do these surveys, we have to look at old and new parties, right? What parties competed in the last election? What parties are competing in the new? Italy has 16 or so parties, and half of them are new since the last election. So it's like very little continuity in terms of. Italy is a chaotic place in terms of party politics. Spain is less so. Spain actually has a lot of parties, but that's because of the regionalist politics. The national system is fairly stable, but Podemos is a new party founded this year. So they were founded a few months before the EP election. They won 8%, and recent polls are showing them as polling as the second biggest party. So brand new party. Left wing, so not right wing, left wing meaning they want more redistribution, they're worried about neoliberal policies and so on. And importantly, they run on a platform of, we're tired of Germany telling us what to do, basically. And they blame that on the Treaty of Lisbon, but you can blame it on anything. They just don't want Germany telling them what to do. Briefly, because as I said, I think John will talk about this, UKIP is the party in the UK that we hear a lot about, just how well they're doing. They barely won any votes in the last election, 3.2%. but they got up to 28% in the EP elections, and polls are showing them now at 14%. So there's quite a bit of concern there that they'll break up the politics. According to our survey, at least, they're the most Eurosceptic party in Europe, which makes sense because they want to get the UK out, right? That's the whole name of the party, UK Independence Party. I would say, before people get too far thinking about UKIP, right? Remember, this is a protest party that voters like one thing about, right? Or two things in their case. They're worried about immigrants, especially non-European immigrants, and they're worried about the EU. But 60+% don't think they're trustworthy. 50+% think they're full of oddballs and extremists. I don't know who came up with these questions. It's not my survey, but I like it. It's The Economist, by the way, where it came from. YouGov is the source. And this is an important part. UKIP is a protest party with no realistic policies, right? Nobody thinks you're just going to like opt out completely of the EU and ban all immigrants. Like that's just not, it's not part of what British people see themselves as. And so that's
just interject quickly then. Did you expect that this would be people are just protesting and they're assuming that this European election really doesn't mean anything? Just fun and games.
I think that's what a lot of people would say is that the European parliamentary elections, people can register a protest vote on one issue, knowing that it's not going to affect like all the policies that the UK does, and it's an effective threat, right? The public gets to put this threat forward. UKIP's not going to do anything in the European Parliament anyways. If they get elected as a third party in Parliament, then it becomes a little bit different. One of the things that came out last week was an Ipsos Mori survey that was talking about whether Brits want to stay in or get out of the EU. And I think this is an interesting thing. So UKIP is rising in popularity. There's potentially going to be a referendum about staying in the EU in the next couple of years. So you'd think these things would go together and people would be more anti-EU in Britain. But in fact, the green is stay in. And we've seen a rise in the last 2.5 years of that. And I think one of my colleagues, Eric Tillman, at DePaul, argues that he thinks this rise actually has something to do with UKIP, because UKIP is raising the profile of the issue. And so what happens is voters in the UK see that and they get a little worried, right? They don't want UKIP's vision of Britain to be theirs. So they're quite concerned about that. And that kind of sparks the this is more evidence that the EU support is on the rebound. But as my last little bit, I want to talk about what does this mean for democracy. This is something I'm interested in now, is about whether or not these radical right parties, especially, and the far right parties, can capture the public. If they get enough votes, they win elections, they can get in the government, they can actually do some of these things. And I think, in my view, it would be damaging if they completely restricted immigration, for instance, or if multiple countries got out of the EU. So this is something that interests me. What we did here is we lined up these parties and party families, which you can think of loosely as those party groups in the EU. So the Christian Democrats are the right-wing party, right? So this is more right-wing over here, more left-wing. The party is the dot, and the public supporters are the, what is that, a diamond? Okay. So what we find here is that, so we're putting them on the same scale. The kind of classic parties are pretty close to their voters. The socialists, the conservatives, and the Christian Democrats are all pretty tight with their voters. So some are more left, some are more right than their voters, but pretty close, which means that the party position on issues and the voter positions are pretty close. That's not true for the radical right, or for the green, actually. The green, of course, are closer on green issues. The radical right are the furthest apart. They're at 8 on the scale, which is near, well, it is the maximum for this, but 10 is the max, whereas their voters are only at 6. So this goes back to that UKIP, like, their policies aren't realistic. I think they're not even close to their own voters. This is not the public, right? This is not all British voters. This is just radical right voters. Okay, so that's the good story, right? They're not actually going to win votes because they're so far away. This is the bad version of that story. This is about the EU position. It's almost exactly reversed. So in all cases, in this, don't ask me why, but now the diamonds are the parties. So the parties are all more favorable towards the EU than the voters. Okay, these are the voters, these are the parties. Quite a bit of gap too. So it's not even close. The parties are way more supportive. I think we could talk about globalization as another issue where this happens, where we might think there are good reasons for that. But check the radical right. They're the tightest on it. So radical left also, right? Why are these so close? Because those are the two most Eurosceptic groups, right? The closest to the public. The other one, and this is something else I care about that's not about it's slightly about the EU, is about immigration. And again, a radical left, or the Greens are the furthest, socialists are pretty far, but you get up here and the radical right are the closest to their voters on it, right? And in fact are the only ones more anti-immigration than their voters. So my optimistic story is that when voters vote on the issues that they actually care most about, which as here is jobs, health, economy, law and order, things like that, they're going to vote with the mainstream parties. If immigration and the EU maintain salience and are the most important issues, it's going to project voters towards that. So that's the way that I'll end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Seth. Yeah, why don't we turn over to John? And I know maybe some students have to leave in a few minutes, but hopefully they can stay for a while. But in any event, if you have to leave, please exit quietly. But so we'll take over to John McCormick and his side of the story. We're on the same side. I don't know. We'll find out.
Actually, there's some overlap in coordination.
Yours or mine?
You notice the way we dressed almost exactly the same. We actually did not coordinate, but we come to some very similar conclusions. I'm going to be, there we go. I thought I'd try and be a little bit provocative, since it's a cold and nasty day outside. So I'm going to make some general arguments. First of all, I think the results of the European Parliament elections in terms of Eurosceptics has been overstated. Euroscepticism is still very much a minority view in Europe. It's as much about nationalism in some European Union member states. It's as much about general political dissatisfaction at home. And it's as much about hostility to immigration, a point that Seth made, as it is about hostility to the European Union. So when we look at Euroscepticism, we have to be very careful about how we define it. The European Union has become a very easy target for people who are unhappy. They're unhappy at home, they're unhappy about immigrants, they're unhappy about the state of the economy, they're unhappy about all kinds of things. They can take it out on the European Union. The European Union has always been seen as an elitist organization, so for these malcontents, the EU is something that deserves to be punished, and deserves to be punished at the ballot box. There is a declining faith in the European Union. It is true if you look at the public opinion polls, but there is also declining faith in national government in pretty much every European Union member state, as there is in the United States. So what we see happening in the EU is not just a European phenomenon in many ways, it's also a liberal democratic phenomenon. And then it's interesting that if you look at the polls, the trust in national government is lower than trust in the European Union. The EU actually comes out quite well if you look at the results of public opinion polls. And then finally, I'm going to make the argument that most Europeans do not understand the EU, and therefore the debate about the EU is fundamentally flawed, and we have to be very careful about how we interpret the results of elections and polls and so on. So, let me give you 6 reasons why the European Parliament elections results were overstated. First of all, turnout has fallen fairly substantially since the EP first had direct elections in 1979. Now the good news is that between 2009 and 2014 it barely fell. It fell by a fraction of a percent. So actually that's quite good news. But still it's 43%, which is really quite bad. If you look at the results of this election this year, at most, anti-establishment parties, so I'm putting Euroscepticism in there with all of the people that are unhappy with just everything. If you add them up, they won 13% of the vote. Now if you do the math, 43% turnout, 13% voted for anti-establishment parties. That means that only 6% of all eligible voters in the European Union supported these parties. If magically you could have 100% turnout in all of these countries, I don't think that the proportion would be the same. I think you'd find that the kind of people who turn out at EP elections are just kind of annoyed, and many of them are making actually very good and rational decisions. Many of them are just simply annoyed, and this is an opportunity to show their annoyance.